If you have a question, there's a chat function there on the right hand. You're more than welcome to ask a question throughout the presentation, and we will get to it. You don't need to wait till questions at the end. And what will happen is if you have a question, the presenter will read it out loud and answer it. And then if there's a follow-up or a dialogue that needs to happen, Sean can unmute your microphone so we can have that engagement. Okay, so with that, it looks like we're 2 after. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Richard Shaheen. So he is our Transmission Senior Vice President, and he is going to kick off the workshop for us.
All right, thank you, Laura, very much. And I think you said it, but I'll repeat it just in case that this session is being recorded this afternoon, so everyone knows. Thank you, everyone, for joining the BPA transmission team this afternoon. As Laura said, I am Richard Shaheen. I am the Senior Vice President of BPA's Transmission Services. In a moment, I'll be passing the mic to some other leaders within the transmission org to walk through what we have planned for today, which I would describe as an information sharing session. It's focused on how our transmission grid is evolving in both physical context as well as in policy and processes. There's a lot of efforts underway, many parts of which many of you may be familiar with, but today we wanted to bring all of those pieces together in one story and ensure everyone's awareness of all of the chapters that make up that entire volume. But before we begin talking about the evolution of the grid and what's coming, let me pause and acknowledge the current state of our BPA transmission grid. We can go to the next slide. So this is a view that's probably familiar to everyone. It's our BPA transmission infrastructure. It consists of over 15,000 circuit miles of transmission lines that BPA owns and operates, and it's growing. By some measures, we're about 75% of the transmission in our service territory. With that transmission line infrastructure, we also operate over 260 substations. In addition to that, we also own and operate over 3,500 miles of fiber optic network, plus many communication sites via antennas, microwaves, what have you. But it's a pretty large telecom system on top of the transmission electric system. With all of that, BPA's transmission services provide service to over 300 customers, and I would say 300 diverse customers, many different needs, many different services required. I mention all of this because before we get into tomorrow, I wanted to acknowledge today. It's a pretty large grid, and there's a lot of parts and pieces that require care. We continually maintain the grid. We continually respond to emergencies involving the grid day in and day out, providing what we hope is safe, reliable, and cost-effective services, transmission and communication services to the communities we serve. And that's no easy task. There's a lot of maintenance, there's a lot of response, there's a lot of challenges, be it ice storms, snowstorms, windstorms, wildfires, heat domes, and that's Mother Nature. Then there's the human elements that we have many challenges at as well. But all that said, it's a pretty large system that we currently maintain. What we're going to be talking about the rest of today is what we're going to be adding to that. And it's quite a bit. So again, I'd be remiss if I didn't stop and pause and just appreciate the amount of work that's currently going on with what we currently have as we talk about what we're going to add to with the additional work. So let's go on to the next slide. And now let's start talking about the evolution. So back to why we are here. Like I said, there's a lot underway, so there's a lot to share. This pictorial just gives you a sense of the many little changes that are adding up to a large change for our entire transmission grid, the transmission evolution. What we're going to go through today by way of an agenda is basically 3 chapters. First, we'll talk about key influences and drivers, things such as state clean energy requirements, carbon-free goals at local, state, and federal levels, electrification of our communities, things especially, as you see in the picture here, electrification of our transportation system, as well as just the inherent growth, both in commercial and residential terms, by all the communities and customers within our service territory. Quite a large amount of growth, I might add. Then there's the changes in generation mix, also shown in this pictorial. It's not as it was yesterday or years ago. The years in front of us will be quite a different view of the generation mix. And older generation will be shutting down and newer generation will be added to some of the generation that will remain online. All of that kind of adds up to a huge amount of queue growth. And by queue growth, I mean generation interconnection requests, transmission service requests, line to load interconnection requests, and exponential growth based on all those previous noted influences and drivers. It's an overwhelming amount of change. It's an overwhelming amount of needs. And it's an overwhelming amount of work. But it's the evolution in front of us that we are committed to bringing forward. The second chapter that we'll go through is what transmission is doing now in face of those influences and drivers. And that's broken into 3 sections. First, there's the physical transmission build out. We'll go through a lot of the projects that are in the pipeline to add physical infrastructure to the existing grid. We'll also touch on emerging technologies that are also a workload, something that we have to continually monitor, continually review, and continually prepare for integrating into the system should they come to be. Things such as small modular reactors, offshore wind. I mentioned electrification of our transportation system, clean hydrogen, and the list goes on, and the list is going to grow. Many things that we aren't even aware of yet that are going to advance and be part of the transmission grid evolution. So it's also a very important part of our work going forward. And then the third section of that second chapter is the BPA transmission policies that are in flight. All of those things I just mentioned require changes, advancements, improvements to our existing manner of carrying out our work and processing all the needs of all the customers and communities that we serve. So a heck of a lot of amount of policy and process changes in flight that we'll touch on as well as part of what is transmission doing now. We'll conclude with the third chapter of the book, which is where is transmission headed? And part of that is the refresh of the BPA strategy, followed closely and synchronized to the refresh of the transmission business model. We also, as I mentioned, have changes in policies, changes in regulations, changes in compliance, many things that are influencing what's ahead of us. And then lastly, I'll note changes potentially in markets. And we have to be prepared with a grid that can operate successfully in those potentially changed markets as well. So that's our agenda for today. Next slide.
Hey, Richard, before we move on, Fred Hewitt had his hand raised for a couple of minutes. Can we check in and see what his question is?
Sure.
Fred, if you unmute, you can ask your question.
But these new manuals would say, so simple it works.
Fred, you're unmuted now, but you're a little dinny. It's a soft voice. You're not coming in with a strong signal.
I'm going with the It's the feedback that I wrote that. It's an Elon Musk project. So does it even really? I guess the actually.
I agree with, yeah. Fred, we're not able to hear you. Could you type your question into the chat?
I'm gonna go ahead and mute Fred until, is that okay, Laura?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that help, Laura and Sean and Fred. We'll watch for what you type into the chat and try to respond. I just had this one last slide, so I'll just continue finishing this up, and we'll try to hopefully by then see the question at hand. But with all that said, I also want to acknowledge there's a lot of uncertainties going forward, no small amount of which there are uncertainties. You can see a splash of headlines on this slide. This could have just been yesterday's newspaper. The amount of changes, the amount of new things that arise as we go forward is endless. And these are things we have to keep a very close watch on and make sure we incorporate into our planning going forward, which makes communicating and collaborating super critical in managing all of these efforts in the evolution of our grid. So something we can all be part of and all contribute to for the success of all of us in our system. So with that, I'm not seeing the question posted, so I'm just going to keep moving forward until we have something to respond to there, Laura. With that, I'm going to turn it over now to our first transmission leader to cover the first chapter of what I described, and that's Ricky Bustamante, our BPA Manager of Transmission Planning, and he will go through Chapter 1, the key influences and drivers that we're facing. Thank you. I look forward to today's session. Ricky, take it away.
All right, thank you, Richard. Thanks for the great introduction there and overview of the agenda. So I'll take it from here and go over some of the key influences and drivers that we're seeing, which a lot of those, at least snippets of them, were captured in that headlines slide that Richard shared. And if you couldn't see it very well or didn't get to read a lot of them, you know, some of the things that are kind of front and center and like Richard alluded to is just a smattering of them, right? There's a lot of others that are out there, but things like electrification, resiliency, climate change, the data centers and large load growth in general, grid funding and emphasis on grid expansion at the seams and regional transmission, the National Transmission Planning Study, offshore wind, resource adequacy, you know, green resources, and perhaps most troubling of all, you know, some of the cyber and physical attacks that we've been confronted with here recently. It's a lot to try and manage and get our heads wrapped around it, but we'll kind of dive into a couple of those here and then kind of move forward and illustrate how some of those are impacting the work that's in front of us here at Bonneville. So we can go to the next slide, Sean. So here it has some of the regulatory policies that are out there and that we are tracking and are influencing some of what we're seeing. You know, kind of the first tranche of them start to take place in 2030 and extend out into 2040, 2045, and 2050 when the national net zero greenhouse gas emission target takes place. You know, but I think that we do need to recognize that obviously, you know, a lot of our footprint, 15,000 mile footprint, is located in the states of Oregon and Washington, and those two states have some of the most progressive and aggressive decarbonization policies of any states in the country. So what we anticipate to see is that first, a reduced reliance on some of the emitting resources that are contained in our footprint, and then an eventual retirement. Of particular concern is about 45. Is it not sound very good?
It's a little gravelly, Ricky, and so some folks may have trouble hearing. I can make you out, but it is a little like gravelly. It's not
Got
as
it.
clear.
I wonder if I should switch to my desk phone here. Let me see. Switch it
I
on. Try and do it.
appreciate the customer feedback. Important that you guys can actually make sense of what we're trying to convey here today.
Is that better, Sean?
Yeah, actually, that sounds a lot better.
Okay. Okay, sounds great. Sorry about that. Oh, good. Thank you, Sydney. Why don't I think, just to avoid going back too much, why don't I just summarize by saying that you know, there's a lot of policies in the Northwest that we're tracking, and in particular, the reduced reliance on an eventual retirement of carbon-emitting resources is, of course, something that is kind of front and center in our industry in general. Today, we have about 4.5 gigawatts of emitting resources west of the Cascades. And so of particular interest to us are those resources that are kind of co-located or mingled amongst the large load centers that we have, and kind of on the right side of the limited transmission capacity that we have across Cascades. And so as we march closer to 2040, 2045, and 2050, that transmission congestion is something that will be on our minds and that we'll be looking at very closely, and we'll share some plans on how we, kind of the first step to try and get us some of that cross Cascades capacity. On the next slide, I'm going to present some information that was shared by PNUC. You know, PNUC is a membership of utilities, and they shared that you know, today we have about 7 gigawatts of wind and solar interconnected onto the system, and they expect that we'll see another 10 gigawatts interconnected in the next decade of renewable resources. And if you kind of dig into the graph there, what you'll see is that they expect another about 2.5 to 3 gigawatts of wind to come on, 2 gigawatts of solar. Today, our queue, and we'll see some of this in other graphics in a second here, solar plus storage really dominates our queue, and they expect to see about 3 gigawatts of that, a tiny bit of wind plus storage, and then another 2 gigawatts of just straight storage capacity as well. So as we think about the evolving grid, we'll be thinking about, you know, where these resources are going to come online and how we expect to get them delivered to their requested points of delivery. On the next slide, another topic that is really front and center is the prospects of electrification. So electrification is basically taking things that are not powered by the electric grid today and converting them over to be electric or battery powered, you know, and then we have charging implications. So some of the potential largest contributors to that could be electric vehicle adoption, in particular, like fleet adoption. And, you know, in particular there, you'd be concerned about things like school districts electrifying buses, or for our region, you know, the ferry system being electrified, which could be very large consumers of electricity. Seattle City Light did a study in conjunction with EPRI, and they found that loads could increase in 100% decarbonized future by up to 75% in the summer and up to 260% increase in total load in the winter within Seattle's footprint. That was part of the EPRI P199 workforce, and since this study was published, I've joined that workforce because I have interest in trying to conduct some kind of a view like that and study so that we can look at what the kind of Northwest implications as a whole would be from something like electrification. On the right-hand side there, you can see a graphic that displays the 2021 largest wildfires in the Northwest. Of course, you know, it seemed like it took a little bit longer than last year for the heat to come on, but if you're here in the Portland metro area, you'll recognize that I believe it's nearly 80 degrees out today and supposed to eclipse 80 tomorrow. And this is kind of one of the phenomenons that we've been seeing, you know, that we have sustained, longer sustained hot spells during the summer and colder and longer sustained you know, snowfall and just general cold snaps in the winter. And that's something that we expect to continue to come along. And kind of together, it raises the resiliency question too, you know, as you have more sectors that electrify, and then you have this increased challenge of maintaining resiliency, or perhaps needing to even increase resiliency as the sectors that are being added onto the electric grid create kind of more importance and more resiliency challenges for us. On slide 9, we'll start to get into some of the how these things that I've just covered, the drivers, are manifesting in terms of the products that Bonneville offers. So Bonneville administers 3 distinct queues. We have our line and load interconnection queue depicted on the left-hand side there. Today, typically, we're seeing like large data center and manufacturing interest predominantly show up in our load interconnection queue. We'll dive into that in a little bit here, into each of these in a little bit. And then on the right-hand side, you have our generator interconnection queue, which, like basically every utility, RTO, and ISO in the country, we're seeing an explosion of interconnection interest for new resources. It's predominantly, like I mentioned, ever since about 2017, we've shifted to predominantly solar, and most of the requests today are actually solar plus some sort of battery storage component associated with them as well. In the middle, we have the transmission service queue depicted. So on the transmission service front, customers enter requests for new long-term firm transmission, and they can opt to be requested to be studied for conditional firm service if they would like. And in the transmission space, we're looking at the delivery of the resource. So we're given a point of receipt and a point of delivery and what the requirements are to get that resource to the point of delivery. We can jump forward to slide 10, Sean. So in slide 10, we're going to dive into some of the specifics of what we're seeing in the queue, starting with generation interconnection. So you know, I think first, like Richard had mentioned, it's important to kind of recognize that we do have a successful track record of integrating renewable resources onto our system. Today, we have about 7 gigawatts of wind interconnected into the system and about 500 megawatts of solar. In part, some of that was through successful transmission builds, which we'll get into a little bit more of that in a bit here too, such as Schultz-Watoma, Big Eddy Knight, McNary, John Day, Central Ferry, Lomo, and others. That was kind of yesteryear, so to speak, and now we're seeing just a new tremendous increase in interest in interconnection requests for new generations. Of course, driven at least in part, if not mostly, by Washington CETA, Clean Energy Transformation Act, and Oregon HB 2021 decarbonization targets. As well as, I think we anticipate that the bipartisan infrastructure law and the investment IRA, what was investment, apologies, I don't remember what the R stood for, I'm sure a lot of you do, that target transmission, target decarbonization, and are sure to spur on more interest in bringing on renewables. Inflation Reduction Act, that was it, I think. FERC has also taken notice of this nationwide problem, like I mentioned. So FERC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking that targeted generation interconnection reform. They have not published the final rulemaking. That's something that Bonneville is looking at closely. But as I'm sure some of you on the phone were aware, perhaps even attended, Bonneville, and we'll cover more later as well, Bonneville has decided to take on some of those reforms ahead of the rulemaking and are working with our customers to get feedback on some of those proposals, and we will move them through as part of a tariff modification process. Today, the queue on the left-hand side is the cumulative just request. So each request for interconnection is assigned a number. So you can see the number of the requests on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, that's the megawatts that are a sum of the megawatts that are requested in those requests. And so you can see we're just seeing exponential growth there. Today, the queue actually, these graphics basically need to be updated daily at this point. Today, the queue sits at about 142 gigawatts. On the next side, we'll see the distribution of those requests in terms of fuel types. So we have about 50 gigawatts of solar requests on our system, and another about 50 gigawatts of energy storage. And like I mentioned earlier, we're not seeing as much interest in wind development lately. However, there is still 20 gigawatts, so for a system that peaks at about 30 gigawatts in the winter, that's a significant amount of new resources to be looking to interconnect onto the system. And so those studies have become progressively more challenging, are taking longer to complete, and the nature of the first in, first studied interconnection process that we run today has become unwieldy, and so that's kind of the target for the reforms that we're seeking in conjunction with our customers. Next slide. We will shift to transmission service, so that piece, the delivery piece, on this slide here. So first and foremost, again, we're seeing a tremendous increase here as well. You can see some of the numbers similarly to the generation interconnection slide on the bottom there. Left-hand side is the number of requests by study year. So you can see that's progressively increasing with the exception of a slight dip in 2020 there. And then on the right-hand side is the megawatts that are in study in that given year. 2023 is not on here. The high point there is the 11 gigawatts that was studied in last year's cluster study, but the planners within transmission planning here are actively studying 17 gigawatts of requests that are in the 2023 cluster study. I do want to acknowledge, no doubt a lot of you became aware yesterday of the delay in this year's cluster study. That was driven in part by the tremendous amount of requests that we received, and we're studying and making sure that we will develop plans that will maintain the reliability that we all appreciate and the value of the long-term firm transmission product that we're trying to preserve while finding the right plans of service to grant these requests that we're seeing. Also, in part, we did some efforts coordinating with some of those requesters in the cluster study to get clarity on the data exhibits that were being issued that were tied to those requests, and to make sure that the planners had the information that they needed in order to conduct a robust, thorough cluster study that would generate reliable plans of service that were actionable and that we felt comfortable with granting. These requests, a lot of them will show, actually, why don't we do that? Why don't we flip to the next slide there? Thank you, Sean. So what you can see, this is the breakout of the 2023 cluster study. I don't believe this is a graphic that we often share externally, but it is something that we generate and look at internally. So on the right-hand side, you can see the points of delivery where the different requests are requesting to deliver the resources to. At the top is the most popular point of delivery, the Mid-Sea hub. But second and third are the Seattle and Puget areas, or sorry, Seattle and Puget area, and then the Portland area you can see is third this year. Those are typically 2 and 3, and depending on the year, you know, it could be Portland has more, it could be that Seattle has more. Oh, looks like there's a question on slide 12. Maybe we should go back to that before I get too far ahead here. So let's see, the question is, could you elaborate on the last bullet on slide 12? The requested transmission services far outpacing the regional demand. Yeah, thank you, Jason. That's actually exactly where I was headed, but with the graphic on the next slide. So if we could go back to slide 13, actually, Sean. So like I was mentioning, you know, we're getting tremendous interest in deliveries to Seattle and the Portland area, Puget Sound Energy and Portland General Electric, as well as others. You know, you can see Umatilla, interest in getting to Umatilla has really grown, and then the rest of the requested points of delivery at the bottom of the slide there. And then you have the points of receipt, so where the origin of the resource is on the left-hand side. And, you know, the DC Intertie, the Coy, and then Umatilla, Southern Oregon Coast, Tri-Cities are kind of the highest there. So what I meant, or what was meant by that last bullet on the last slide that said transmission services far outpacing regional demand. So since 2019, Bonneville has studied 17 gigawatts, and that number actually doesn't count these 11 gigawatts that are in front of you on this graphic. So 17 gigawatts of total requests to the Puget and Portland area. So if we did add these 11, that would be what, 28 gigawatts of total requests delivering to Portland and Puget. And what's meant by that bullet is that when we look at the IRPs that are issued by Puget Sound Energy and Portland General Electric, although, you know, to be fair, I have not looked at, I believe both of them released a new IRP just last month, and I don't have those latest numbers. And I do understand and have noted that those progressively increase very drastically. And similarly, I had a phone call with Crystal Ball from PNUC last week, and she mentioned that their forecast for resources coming on will grow drastically this year too, even just from last year. So the demand for these resources is increasing rapidly. However, based on the last set of IRPs, we would expect about 6 gigawatts total for delivery to Puget and Portland. And like I shared, you know, we're studying 11 gigawatts this year on top of the 17 that we studied since 2019. So that's what's meant by the requests for delivery are far outpacing what the load service entities' demands have been. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide there, Sean, and hopefully, Jason, that answered your question, but if not, go ahead and type something in the queue because we are going to shift to load service now. So on the load service front, kind of alluded to this earlier too, you know, one of the things that I've been sharing is that it's been like for, I think, most utilities, you know, load growth has been pretty stagnant still, really since like the 2000s-ish. We've only seen about a 1% load growth. Summer mostly actually has been a little bit more aggressive than winter, just with the penetration of air conditioning loads in our area. So load growth generally has been about 1%, except in select communities where we've seen like 100 years worth of load growth, basically overnight, or the requests seem to be for delivery basically overnight. And that's predominantly when large data centers look to integrate into those areas. We do see a lot of interest right now, like in the Hillsborough area, for example, and it's coming on incredibly fast. I'm actually from the Hillsborough area, and I remember sharing with my transmission planners when, I think the name of the road has changed, but when I think it's Brookwood Parkway, the exit if you're headed west after Cornelius Pass. PGE had done some new substation builds in that area, as well as the site was kind of being prepped for development. And it seems like it was just 2 years ago I was telling them, hey, there's a lot of land out there that looks like it's prime for development. And now when I drive out there, I mean, it seems like it's all full, it's all built out already. So the pace of business is just incredibly fast. The loads that we're seeing jammed into these buildings are incredibly large, and the interest seems to be kind of ubiquitous, just in kind of varying areas across our service territory. Some of the hottest are listed there in terms of demand for large load growth: Central Oregon, Umatilla, Pend Oreille, the Hillsborough Forest Grove area, Longview, Cowlitz, and the Tri-Cities areas, but there are others certainly, and I'm sure some of you are from those areas as well. I see another question came in here. There's a sense that the IRPs are a lagging indicator. They still don't fully reflect load increases needed to achieve clean energy goals and needs. Yeah, I think IRPs are a data point that we have access to and we monitor. Of course, we also have direct communication with our customers and interest in bringing on renewables, and where they are looking to source those renewables from are often the subject of conversations. And we have had conversations with some customers where they've told us, maybe even kind of warned us, the numbers are increasing. So I think you're probably right, Stuart, in that they probably can be somewhat lagging. I don't know what drives that, presumably the time to turn them around, get them approved and things like that. But we do understand, I mean, the general trend obviously has been that the demand is steadily increasing, and to what degree they will continue to increase at that rate is something that we'll be keeping a very close eye on. I see your question too, Emily. Let me wrap up on this slide here, and then I'll turn to that. So what you're seeing here is the number of requests. Now, granted, given the numbers that I shared on the transmission service request queue and the generation interconnection queue, these can seem pretty low. The one big difference on this slide versus the generation interconnection queue slide in particular is that this is not cumulative on the megawatt requested side, on the right-hand side. Well, neither of them are cumulative. And so in order to get the total amount of load seeking, large load seeking to interconnect under their system, you would sum those columns. So there's like 10 gigawatts. And quite frankly, that does not reflect all of the interest that just hasn't made it into the queue for varying reasons. But 10 gigawatts of load addition, like I mentioned earlier, we have a 30 gigawatt peak load system. And so increasing that by 33% is very, very significant. Okay, Emily has a question. She said, do the load growth projections that BPA includes in its transmission plan account for rising electrification, changing policies? Are they based on historical growth? I think the Seattle Puget load growth estimates BPA's transmission plan about 1% a year. Emily, that question, so we work with our utility partners and with Bonneville's own load forecasting group to arrive at the forecasts that are used in the WEC base cases, which are operational 2, 5, and 10-year cases that for the most part in the Western interconnection, those are the cases that are used for transmission planning. I would say generally they probably don't include electrification, not, kind of, I guess, to significant extent. Most of that gets done in what we would call like scenario planning studies. So we, for example, ran a 80% by 2030 decarbonization study to look at the implications of the Oregon legislation, HB 2021. And so in scenarios, we look at things like that, not necessarily in our WEC base case, contingency analysis, and system assessment that we conduct every year. Yeah, thanks, Rafi. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide here, Sean. Oh, I kind of covered this already too. So just basically it varies a lot. You know, some NT customers seeing tremendous growth, others, and I guess really honestly most, not so much, more in that 1% residential load growth, things like that. But where there is interest in developing, the speed requested for that build out has seemed to be a really hot topic. If we go to the next slide, Sean, the one after this, I don't want to switch yet, but the one after this to kind of prep you, oh, too fast for you, Sean, to kind of prep you for what you're going to see. It goes by decades, starting back in the, well, in 1930, and it steps through, it'll show yellow for lines that were built in that decade. In the subsequent image, they'll turn red, and then in yellow again will appear the lines that were built in that decade. And you can see, you know, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way through to 2020. One of the things that I want you to notice, and there's a graphic that will show this afterwards, though, is that really a lot of, oh, and I should also mention, sorry, this is just for the 500 kV system, so the backbone transmission system in the Northwest. One of the things that you'll notice as you're watching this is that most of the building was done in like the 60s to the 80s. We had about 4,500 miles of 500 kV transmission built in the 60s to the 80s. And since then, in the 90s to the 2020s, we've only built about 300 miles of 500 kV transmission. So Sean, if you can jump to that graphic now. Oh, is this the PDF version, Sean?
Yes, it is. Here, let me float up. I'm going to go off screen for a second, and I'm going to bring up the slideshow version. Hold on.
Okay, sounds good. Maybe while he's doing that, I can talk about some of the implications of that. So basically, you know, as we look to integrate these resources, as we look to electrification, decarbonization, resiliency, national transmission planning, there's generally an understanding that all of that means that there's going to be a need for new transmission, and to what extent varies, but some have estimates. I probably shouldn't even say as high, because like IRPs, it seems to kind of continue to grow also, but some have estimates that the transmission system may need to expand by 3 times to get to a future state where we have a decarbonized future that seem to be the goal of policies today. And, you know, we don't have a ton of experience building out the 500 kV transmission system, and that's something that we're going to have to kind of get comfortable with again and develop plans for, which is the next phase of where we're going here, is what some of those 500 kV builds could look like, and what it'll take to get us there. So Sean, I think it looks like you got it ready, queued up here. So this is 1930s. You can see in yellow the first line, Bonneville to Ross there. And then it'll step through. There we go. So there's the 80s now, 90s, 2000s. So you can see it really starts to slow down after the 80s there. And I see we did get a question. Maybe do you want to run that one more time, Sean? And then we can jump to the question while you're doing that too. So a question from Sydney was, can you comment on why there has been so little build out since the 80s? I think that, you know, I wasn't at Bonneville back then. I've been at Bonneville for 19 years now. I think that part of that is that there was an emphasis on electrifying the region, you know, being an economic engine for the Northwest and getting the transmission system expanded to different areas of the Northwest as part of meeting those goals. I think to some extent, you know, we've been living under the benefits of that overbuilding and overexpansion that was driven by those goals at that time. And so we didn't really have the need to expand that much. Sure, we made key targeted builds about 500 miles since the 90s. But they have been, have been a little bit few and far between.
This is Randy Hardy. Can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Randy.
Yeah. Another major reason was the DSIs all went out of business in the early 2000s, and that was 3,000 megawatts worth of power that got reallocated for public agency load growth. Same power going to different customers, but they all went out of business, so you didn't need any more transmission to meet that public agency load growth.
That's right. Yeah, that's a good point, Randy. Should have thought of that myself. Yeah, great point. So DSI is the direct service industry. So these were largely the aluminum plants that Bonneville directly served that were large loads. But again, kind of in that theme of there wasn't really a need. And I guess what we've been priming to say here is the need is now here again. And in terms of addressing some of that need, I'll walk into some of the projects that were brought forth in the 2022 cluster study last year that we believe will meet that need. So you can step forward, Sean. Oh, here's the graphic. This is mostly in here as a takeaway, so you guys have it when the slides are posted. Go to the next slide again. So the high-level overview, again, just to kind of summarize what we went over, large load centers west of the Cascades, along with about 4.5 gigawatts of emitting resources that will be relied on less and less and eventually likely retired. Replacement resources are all east of the Cascades, whether you're talking about Central Oregon solar, Gorge wind, Montana wind, Wyoming wind, Utah solar, Desert Southwest solar. It's all east of the Cascades. The exception there, of course, being offshore wind, which I'll share some slides on in a second here, well, in several slides. So all of that combined to us leads us to pretty much an assurance that in the future we will see increased flows cross Cascades and along the I-5 corridor. In the 2022 cluster study, we put forth plans that address that congestion. We'll cover those here. On the next slide is the summary of the projects. These address cross Cascades north and south. The Raver-Paul path, limitation kind of in the center of the system between Rock Creek and John Day, which is Goldendale and Rufus, and then some Portland area reinforcements that we saw were required. In terms of what those builds are, on the first slide, we'll start to on the next slide, we'll start to step through them, starting with the Portland area. So in the Portland area, next slide, Sean. On the Portland area, like I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of load growth on the west side of the Portland metropolitan area out near Keeler Substation. That's off Evergreen and Highway 26. A lot of load growth in that Hillsborough area, and we're also seeing the emergence of a south to north issue into the Portland area, kind of north of Pearl. So we have a project. This is in conjunction with some upgrades that Portland General Electric will need to make as well. And we have reinforcement projects such as adding a second 500 to 230 kV transformer at Keeler, developing the Keeler yard, as well as some retermination upgrades that are required on the Pearl-Sherwood line. We're still working through what some of the costs of those projects will be, but we have targeted in-service dates that we're working closely with PGE on that will be before 2023 to meet some of that need, or sorry, 2027 to meet some of those needs. On the next slide, we have the Cross Cascade South reinforcement. I've been telling folks this is my favorite project because I think it does a really good job of highlighting some of the complexities, creativity, and thought process that we use in transmission planning when developing plans of service. So today, there's the existing Big Eddy to Chemawa 230 kV line. Big Eddy is in the Dalles, and Chemawa is in North Salem. Interestingly enough, the Big Eddy Chemawa line, for those of you that go down to Wilsonville, perhaps to the outlet malls, the Big Eddy Chemawa line is the one that runs along I-5 there as you head south out of Wilsonville and towards Woodburn, sorry. So what this project does, it relieves, or I should say it creates Cross Cascade capacity on the Cross Cascade South path that exceeded the needs that were requested in the 22 cluster study for Cross Cascade South transmission. And it takes that existing 230 kV line and it increases it, rebuilds it to 500 kV. And as you can see, it's quite a significant amount of mileage here. So we have about 500 kV line from Big Eddy to Ostranders, about 70 miles, and then another 20 miles of 500 kV line from Ostrander to Pearl. So geographically, that is the Dalles to Carver, if you know where that is. It's like outside of Clackamas, and then from Clackamas over to Wilsonville, just on the other side of the highway from the Costco there, which is where Pearl sits. Then we would need to take the kind of keep Chemawa whole, loop in that line into Pearl, and then keep the 230 kV line down to Chemawa and North Salem. The projected costs, these are very early, and in full transparency, I think basically everyone expects these to go up, these costs to go up. We have not revised the cost yet, though, as we typically wait for our scoping process to move forward in order to get better cost estimates. So these are what we would call planning level cost estimates, $233 million. I think that's good on this one. We have other, some of them are somewhat smaller, things like reconductors. On slide 23, we have the Raver-Paul reinforcement project. So this is a 53-mile reconductor or rebuild of the Cowlitz-Chehalis section of the Covington-Chehalis 230 kV line. I believe this, again, a great example of the transmission planner creativity in revising what was a very large plan of service and finding that this met the needs of the requesters in the study. The Cross Cascades North Reinforcement Project takes existing 500 kV Cross Cascade line, Schultz-Raver 3 and 4 lines. Next slide, Sean, sorry. And reconductors them, as well as adds a series capacitor on one of the lines, as well as some reactive additions. This is a larger project because of the miles associated with these reconductors, and so it has also a projected cost early on, again, of about $200 million. We also have the Ross Rivergate project on here. So this is a project that would, thanks, Sean, that would rebuild the Ross Rivergate, Ross St. John's 230 kV lines. It does include a river crossing. Anytime that there's a river crossing associated with a network upgrade, of course, that brings additional complexities that we'll have to work through. While this is only a 7.5-mile line, some work was done as part of the South of Alston alternative study to look at this potential project. And so we have an early, again, cost estimate of $149 million to complete this rebuild project. Next is that project I alluded to. Won't spend too much time on this. This is just a bottleneck on the system, like I mentioned, between Goldendale and Rufus to upgrade the Rock Creek to John Day section of line here. It's a 500 kV line today, keeps it at 500 kV, but addresses some of the bottlenecks on that section of the line. It's about 20 miles, $40 million direct estimate at this time. So together, these projects bring a lot of capacity onto the system. I know that some folks on the phone have been interested in exactly how much capacity that brings, and we've been messaging that it will take this 2023 cluster study likely to get some of those answers. So we're working on coming up with those numbers, and we'll share that when they're available. If we go to the next slide, though, what we can say is that the projects met the demands of the 2022 cluster study, which were, for all of them, about 4,200 megawatts of projects were enabled by these upgrades. The costs there are cumulative in the estimated project cost column there. So a total of $612 million for these upgrades. Again, those costs are early, and then you can see the revenue estimates based on those megawatts enabled. Now, we didn't have quite that many customers, so not everyone that required these upgrades elected to move into the preliminary engineering and scoping phase for these projects. However, it was more than 2 gigawatts, I believe, elected to move forward, and so all of those projects that I just covered are moving into that preliminary engineering and scoping phase, being funded through our normal processes. And like I said, I believe we'll do a lot to get us beyond the 2030 80% decarbonization target, to get our customers, I should say, beyond those targets.
Hey, Ricky, Spencer's got a series of questions for you if you are at a good place to pause and take those. And Spencer, I don't know if you want to take yourself off mute and ask him directly. Oh, the one thing I do want to make sure everybody is aware of, though, because there have been a couple questions, that this presentation is posted to our website on our transmission business model webpage. And so you should be able to access this presentation there. Spencer?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Ricky, my question is really one question, and I think it's kind of at the core of the tension that you guys are facing. So I wondered if you could just comment on this. The current TSET process of taking long-term firm or conditional firm transmission service requests is quite reactive and may not be the only input Bonneville is relying on for what the market's seeking for transmission service. But in the course of being reactive, it's also relying on requests from power suppliers who are trying to secure transmission service in order to bid into competitive procurement that Bonneville's not running. The IOUs, the investor-owned utilities in the region, are running. So I wondered if you could comment on that tension of a currently pretty reactive process that does have a sort of backstop of mandatory state requirements for that procurement by 2040 and 2045 versus the amount of subscription that Bonneville's seeking or confidence that a line's actually going to get used before you execute on it and build the thing.
Sure. You know, I think I understand the nature of your question, Spencer. I think one of the things that has been on my mind here lately is how do we best kind of summarize and make it consumable, the work that has been done to date. And, you know, tidbits of that were in this presentation so far. One of the things that kind of sticks out to me, though, is that, you know, the 19 gigawatts, what I mentioned earlier, so 19 gigawatts of total demand to the, I'm sorry, it was 17 gigawatts. 17 gigawatts of total demand to the Puget and Portland areas specifically have been studied since 2019. I don't have readily the amount of like nameplate resources that were cited as part of those long-term firm transmission requests that drove that 17 gigawatts of requests that we've studied to Portland and Puget, but suspect, you know, is very high number as well. So I think that one of the things that we should be working on and need to do a better job of communicating is like what's out there already, you know. So, you know, this has been a driver and something that we've been studying for a long time now. And so there are a lot of megawatts, a lot of generation interconnection requesters, and a lot of transmission service requesters that have answers for what it will take to deliver their resource to those areas. And, you know, some of them were granted conditional firm service, some of them were granted service directly, and then some of them have project requirements that are, you know, in front of getting them to long-term firm service. And so I think that, you know, while it can be viewed as being reactionary, it's also something that we have been studying for quite some time now. You know, and we conducted cluster studies before 2019, certainly. And so I think that some of those answers are out there. Some of those start dates are there that would meet the customer needs, and it's just about being able to kind of put all those pieces together for folks so they kind of understand what's out there, what's available, what has answers, and of course, you know, continuing to look forward for what needs to get built. Like I mentioned, all these projects here that I shared have funding to get through preliminary engineering and scoping. And so our intent is to continue to move these forward, but I think that it's important to not lose sight of, you know, what's been done already also, because you know, everyone, I think in transmission planning and probably in large swaths of Bonneville have felt that pressure for some time now.
Ricky, this is Randy Hardy.
Yeah.
Yeah, to follow on Spencer's question, the 6 projects that you have listed and identified as your tier 1 projects, are you actually proceeding on those projects now? Are they in the, or going to be in the capital planning process, and recognize you got a long ways to go before you get to actually starting construction and everything, but are you in fact moving forward on those 6 projects as opposed to waiting for more for more TSRs to sign up before you do anything?
Yeah, that is the case, Randy. Of course, as you well know, we can't announce a decision to build. A decision to build has not been made yet. That's for the administrator to make after NEPA is undergone and other processes that we need to work through. But in terms of kind of our normal approach to capital execution projects, they are funded through the preliminary engineering and scoping effort by the requesters that needed those projects. And so, yeah, we will at least move them through that process, and there will be more, my expectation is that more requesters will need those same projects as part of the 2023 cluster study. And so that will be another opportunity to kind of further disseminate those costs when there's new requesters needing the same pool of projects.
Great, that's what I wanted to know. One other more detailed question. The Big Eddy Chamawa 230 kV rebuild, do you really think the 2030 deadline, for energization deadline for that in the 2022 cluster study is realistic?
I think to some extent I think to some extent it may be too early to comment on that, Randy. I think we will get a plethora of useful knowledge coming out of that scoping process so that we can make a better informed decision on that. You know, like you saw earlier too, it is broken up into distinct sections. So perhaps if there's an opportunity to get part of the benefits through a partial build, you know, that could be something that we look at in terms of sequencing down the line too. I would say that generally, and if you look, you know, nationwide, especially post-COVID, although even prior to COVID, times to energize were being protracted. But 8 years to energization would be pretty aggressive for a build of that magnitude.
Thanks.
You bet. Yeah, and I do want to acknowledge also that, you know, while these projects are being kind of highlighted today, there's a wealth of other projects that are moving forward every day that, you know, maybe I'll just mention a few of them here. You saw some of the Portland area upgrades. We're also moving forward with Longhorn Substation in the Umatilla area, which will be a large driver for meeting the load growth needs out there, as well as be the northern terminus point for the planned Boardman to Hemingway line, the Idaho Power and Pacificor are building. We're looking at a build of a large substation in the Prineville area. Bonanza, we have the Tri-Cities Reinforcement Project, Weber Canyon, and Beaufort Canyon going on. And I mean, there's many others as well.
Ricky, this is Sean. Hey, we've got a number of questions queued up, comments queued up, and so I want to make sure we kind of get to those. I'm gonna bounce back and forth between raised hands that I see and then comments in the things. So if folks could just be patient. So first, Steve, I know you made your comment, but was there a question behind that, or were you just wanting to share that comment?
No, just for a number of decades, I've heard transmission providers point out that there's twice as much demand as there is load, but you know, you got to remember the competitive process requires competition, more bids than demand, and so this is the way it is going to be, and that's all I wanted to point out.
Fair point. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Lauren, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Maybe just check if you can hear me okay.
Yep, you're good.
All right, thanks. This is Lauren Tenney-Dennison from PPC. Thanks, Ricky, for that overview. And I thought those questions were really helpful. Actually, I have a couple follow-ons to Randy's question about where these are in the process and some of the comments in the chat about the build decisions not being made. Could you talk a little bit about what that discussion will look like, about the decision to move forward with these? I think the way that the TSUP discussions have been structured has changed a little bit since NOS, and it just wasn't quite clear to me. You know, is that going to be a big discussion with all stakeholders, or is it really focused between BPA and those participants that have signed on to the build? What does that look like?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Lauren. So I think the bottom line is they're in the normal process and progressing through the normal process already, and funded through to the tune of millions of dollars through the scoping and preliminary engineering process. So they have, you know, pretty significant commitment from those that needed it. So I think what makes the most sense is to just kind of broadly describe the general process. So what happens is the requesters that needed the project fund the preliminary, elect to fund, you know, it's their choice, the preliminary engineering and scoping process if they want to move the projects forward. And so we've cleared that hurdle. Preliminary engineering and scoping will take place. We will get better cost estimates and schedules associated with these projects as part of that process. And there'll be another decision point to be made at that point. And so what happens is that we will take the requester's term of service and megawatts requested to get their pro rata share of the reinforcement projects. And we need a letter of credit from them for their pro rata share. Bonneville, if there's enough interest in moving them forward, maybe before I get there, there's also a rate determination that's made. And so the rate determination is looking at the megawatts that need the projects and their term of service. So how much revenue will come basically from the projects being built, right? Because these projects are enabling these megawatts, and those megawatts are electing to move forward through their transmission service contracts. And so Bonneville in that rate analysis, and this is at a high level, and if others feel the need to correct, please do so on the Bonneville side. But so Bonneville will give those customers rate determination that will say, either based on the megawatts requested and the terms of that service, we can either roll these projects into the network rate or not. And so if the answer is or not, then we would tell them what the incremental rate that they would have to pay for that transmission would be. And let's assume that they can be rolled into the network rate for a second. If they can, and the customers say, yes, we want to move forward, then Bonneville, through our rates, obviously, would fund that capital reinforcement, so our, existing customers, and the projects would move forward through design, through NEPA, administrator's decision, community outreach, all that stuff, and get built. If very similarly, I guess, if the incremental rate would be required and customers elected, then, the same process could be made, go through, make a decision to build. And so that's kind of how this process will play out. There's not a lot that will happen in terms of kind of external communications while the preliminary engineering and scoping process is underway, because this is, engineers and technicians and all the transmission engineering support staff out, boots on the ground, trying to figure out what it's going to take to build these projects and get those better estimates. So they're out engaged in that right now, and based on the funding levels, these projects are moving forward at this point through that normal process.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. And one of the points I was hoping to get to there is when it's time to make the ultimate decision, and I think this gets to some of the points Spencer was making too. If the analysis is done based on what, certainly the requests that have come into the queue are a major part of the analysis about what revenues BPA can expect. But one of the things, and maybe with other questions in the queue, I'll just turn this into more of a comment to take offline. Maybe there's a way in the future when we get to that decision point to continue to evaluate other factors as well. Like what I hear BPA talking about low risk projects, and I think active requests in the queue are part of that. The landscape of the queue is something else. So, thanks for that overview. Maybe more discussion to be had on how stakeholders interact with BPA on that final decision beyond just like, these are the requests, this is the potential impact. What else are we thinking about in making that decision?
Right. Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Yeah, I think you're right. That's probably a good place to leave it. Coming out, I will maybe add, coming out of the 22 cluster study, there was a lot of virtual high fives going on. I was telling Jeff and Richard and others, we have great projects coming out of this cluster study. And, I think that we've really met the mark here and are proposing projects that meet the needs of the region. And, like we've shared, I think to date our customers and those requesters have largely agreed, and I do expect that coming out of this 23 cluster study, there will be an opportunity for others to also, come into this pool that require these projects. And so, maybe don't quote me on this. And Sean, I'm reminded that you said this is being recorded, but I think these projects are a slam dunk from the kind of long-term transmission needs perspective.
Thanks, Ricky.
All right, we're gonna flip. Ben, you had a question. I want to see if you want to just go ahead and ask that, or if you had any clarification in any of the recent. Ben was interested in the status of the M2W project.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, Ben. So my understanding, because of some administrative processes that had to take place, I believe that in May is when we will have the decision back from the requesters of whether they're going to fund the environmental studies associated with M2W moving forward. So that was another project that went or is progressing through the normal capital expansion TSEP process, and so they're at a further milestone where funding has to be made for the environmental studies, and so we will know at some point in May. Maybe if someone knows the precise dates, they can put it in the chat. My understanding is at some point in May we'll have those decisions back.
Thanks, Ricky. Ben, hopefully okay. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Robbie.
Mid-May. Thanks, Robbie.
All right, we're going to flip back over to the Alan. Alan C., you had a question? Alan, you might be on double mute. All right, Alan.
Yes, I'm here. This is Alan Combs. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you now. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Alan Combs with New Energy Works Consulting. I think I have two questions. Is there any, I know that the 2023 TSEP cluster study was communicated will be delayed a few months. Is there any expectation that you won't proceed as planned with the 2024 cluster study that you opened in 2023?
There's not. So the window for putting requests for the 24 cluster study is open, and the other piece that we communicated is that it will be extended so that the participants in the 23 cluster study know what their requirements are before the window for the 24 cluster study closes. So there is every expectation that we will conduct the 2024 cluster study.
So does that, so if, I mean, last year, the cluster study came out in July of 2022, and the window, well, the study window closed in August, which has been the schedule it's been on. So are you basically saying the schedule this year would be after September then?
It'll be after the close of the cluster study, of the 2023 cluster study. That's correct. Yep. So it will not be in August.
Hey, Ricky, this is Ravi. I can help
Robbie.
you with that. Yeah, so Alan, the 24 cluster study will happen. However, once we have offered all the agreements and study results have been provided to the requesters, then we will have a date assigned for the closing of the 24 submittal window. However, Bonneville, as per the TSEP timeline, gives 60 days to the customer prior to the closing of the window. So whether it's going to be in October or December, Bonneville will inform the customers 60 days ahead of that.
Right. That's fine. So my other question is, and this comes from someone who has had to endure transmission planning processes in other jurisdictions that were where the need was not informed by commercial interest. And so very often the conclusion was no transmission was needed because there was some planning study that showed, you know, resources in certain areas were sufficient. So if you move that over to here, where what I'm sort of hearing is that the commercial interest expressed to the TSAP has developed a very robust set, at least maybe a no regrets or robust subset of projects, the ones you've shown, that seem to be highly likely to go forward, and not by the 2022 TSAP participants, maybe the ones waiting in the wings in 2023 or maybe in 2024. That's great. But is there going to be what I would call, and you've also said that this process is sufficient for meeting clean energy standards. I think that's a very bold statement. I don't know if that's true, but that's a bold statement because I've never seen that study. But what I'm getting at, is there going to be an effort to right-size these upgrades to the long-term needs of the region? And there are other areas that have yet to be studied, and obviously offshore wind is one of them. I mean, it was studied in part in the last cluster, but that wasn't a complete study of offshore wind. And I do believe Montana wind needs to be brought back. There's plenty of other, what I would call either right side or bottoms up analysis of transmission needs in the region. And honestly, I don't know where that goes on. I know it's supposed to go on a northern grid, but are you communicating that the TSEP process was sufficient for serving the long-term needs of this area? That's my question.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, you know, when we're in planning, we look at different timelines, right? So from the transmission planning studies that we've conducted, I believe that we have projects in place and in-service dates, largely I'm talking about the Portland area projects, that will get us to the 2030 decarbonization policies. I think, yes, we can meet that 80%.
Actually, how can you make that statement? I mean, I'm not sure I mean, I think unless you've done other studies on the actual production cost modeling that results in a,
well, this is about load service, right?
Resources in the queue, but that's different from actually determining that's the best least cost fit of a region to meet what's essentially 100% clean carbon standard. Right?
Well, I don't know that best least cost fit is the target, I guess. The target here is on the reliability front, right, Alan?
I mean, if it's a robust set of results from TSEP, I absolutely agree. I mean, these projects are like low-hanging fruit. I mean, they're not cheap. They're not easy to do, and I agree. You've found very efficient solutions, right? Like uprating voltage. But I don't know how you can actually make the claim that they meet the region's decarbonization standards. I mean, was there a study that I missed? I just don't understand how you can make that statement. That's all. I'll stop there.
We did conduct a 80% decarbonization study. We shared those results with the utilities in the Portland and Puget Sound area. And, I mean, quite frankly, it's too late to be, to not think that we could meet the 2030 requirements, or that we can enable our customers to meet the 2030 requirements. So yeah, I believe that we have plans in place. We've communicated with those customers, and I believe that we can meet the 2030 80% targets.
Okay, maybe I'm not. I wasn't hanging up on 2030. Are you looking at the 100% clean energy standards, which are farther out, 2040?
Yeah,
2045.
Sure, that's where I was saying, from a planning perspective, we look at discrete chunks of time, right? So that gets us to 2030. Then how do we get beyond 2030? I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think what we do know is that these projects will go a long ways towards getting us there. How far they will go, again, we don't necessarily know that yet. We know from the 22 cluster studies that it enabled 4,200 megawatts of service. Not that many megawatts took it. It was about 2,000 megawatts took that service. Coming out of the 22 cluster study, we'll reuse those projects in the 23 cluster study as kind of the baseline. That'll give us a sense of more than likely how far they will get us, but we're also going to try and figure out how to best communicate how far they will get us. You know, getting to 100%, there's a lot of challenges there that I think there's, you know, a plethora of studies out there that talk about that, you know, whether the penetration levels of inverter-based resources and lack of spinning inertia, the need for storage and long-term storage, potentially days-long storage, resiliency, electrification. I mean, all these things play into getting to 100%. And I think the fact of the matter is that there's not anyone in the country, probably not anyone in the world, that has the answer of what's it going to take to get us to 100% decarbonized future.
Hey, Ricky, I do want to add in this, Jeff Cook. There is a National Transmission Planning Study that DOE is also sponsoring. Certainly that's at a much broader look to see us to get there. And as Ricky mentioned, they see challenges to get us to 100%, certainly in the time frame that's being thought after. From a regional perspective, certainly we have the 20-year study that Northern Grid is working on that's going to be coming out later this year. Will help give us a baseline to start with to see where we need to start focusing some of that attention on, whether it's in the Puget area or Portland area or wherever. So it's not like there's nothing going on for the 2040, 2050 timeframe. Those are things that are actively underway, and BPA is actively participating in all of those. And in fact, the gentleman who's running the National Transmission Planning Study from a technical perspective is actually out of Ricky's group. So we're very tied into that.
Thank you, Jeff.
Alan, is that good for now? And again, for folks, everybody on the phone, today is an opportunity to get the conversation started, and there's going to be lots more to come down the road. But getting everybody to a common baseline was really the key objective today. Obviously, we really enjoy hearing a lot of these comments, and these discussions are healthy, but we do have a limited amount of time and a bunch of people. So Alan, do you have any other questions, or are you good for right now?
Oh, and I meant to say, Alan, actually, offshore wind is the next set of slides here.
Great. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Emily, you had a question around how a certain amount of the 612 million is financed. Did Ricky, when we went through the process earlier, did that answer that question?
Hi, yes. I don't know if you can hear me. That mostly answered it. Although I think just a little more clarification would be helpful. Is it that you need to secure all of the customers to be able to then put that money forward, or is this funding that BPA could just put forward itself?
Well, so yeah, I think the basis for that process, and again, this is the kind of standard, years back process that we undergo. The basis for that is rooted on not putting cost risk on the existing network customers to enable new network service. So that's why that rate analysis is done the way it is. The decision to build doesn't have to be directly tied to that, but that's kind of the idea behind the process, is that, these requests drove the need for this expansion, and either the megawatts enabled and the transmission service that they're committing to take pays for the cost of the upgrades, or it doesn't. And so if it doesn't, then that means that those costs are being subsidized by the existing network ratepayers. And so that's kind of the basis for that being the process.
Emily, did you have another question in there as well? There was something about.
Oh, thank you. That one was already answered about when construction would be started. Thanks.
Great. Stuart, you had a couple of clarifying questions. Did we answer those for you through the chat? Hoping so. While Stuart responds, Blake, you're up next. Thank you, Stuart.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, Blake Weathers with Umatilla Electric Cooperative. Ricky, thanks for the presentation today. You've covered a lot. I have a two-part question for you. Forgive me if somebody else asked this. I had to step out for a fire alarm in our building for about 10 minutes. So,
oh, bummer. No worries.
Yeah. So first part is, so I'm for fear of oversimplification, but if I could capture these projects into a paragraph or less, maybe. These projects move renewables from east to west, provide resiliency and load growth, and support load growth in the Puget and Sound and Portland areas, and might provide broader system benefits, maybe ATC or capacity, but that's still yet to be determined, question mark. And then second part is it safe to assume that NT customers' 10-year load forecasts are included in the underlying base case that feeds into this TSEP process or these study results? In other words, if I'm an NT customer not in Portland or Seattle, can I assume my load growth is being planned for and system is being reinforced accordingly, assuming that we are communicating with you early and often, as I think that's a term you use later on in the presentation? Is that a safe assumption? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Blake. And I hope everyone's safe there, by the way. Hopefully it was just someone's toast. Okay, good deal. Yeah, so I think on the first question, again, these projects were driven by the TSEP process, right? So there are some NT load forecasts that come in and have to get studied as part of the cluster study process as well. What we know is that they enabled in the 23 cluster study, the 4,200 megawatts is still on the screen there, and only about 2 gigawatts have signed up. So there is some ATC there that's generated that's not being utilized, but again, most likely, I don't know how much, I guess, but some of that at least, if not all, will be a requirement for some of these 2023 cluster study projects as well. But yeah, I mean, certainly anytime that we have what I've been calling like wire in the air benefit, which most, if not all these projects bring, it certainly helps with resiliency, it helps with outages, helps with all kinds of things. So, in terms of the network as a whole, they bring ATC, they bring resiliency, they bring capacity, good projects for everyone that's part of that network. To your second question, generally the studies are conducted using 5-year out cases. Mostly, I think that's pretty general too, although there's issues with this when you talk about the times to build as well. But I think the question is basically, what is the base case? And so the base case is a 5-year case. We're looking at all of our existing obligations plus load growth and making sure that we're solid, can meet all those obligations out 5 years, and then layering in the requests on top of that. And then there's a variety of different scenarios that are looked at on top of that, right? Like high wind, low wind, imports, all that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
You bet.
All right. Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Blake. Fred, Mr. Hewitt, you are up next.
Hi there, it's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. So following up on the exchange that I've been having with Jeff Cook in the chat, a little bit of background. In 2017, Renewable Northwest and Northwest Energy Coalition submitted kind of a proposal paper to Bonneville. One part was on TSEP. I want to say thank you to Bonneville for all the great work on improving the queue management process, and there was just a 1.5-day workshop on that, which I was sitting in on part of, and the many other pieces that Bonneville is doing to deal with the queue directly. But the other part, the part that I basically proposed, was about the longer term and about, and I would raise this again as, is Bonneville willing to consider doing a public assessment process. I'm going to avoid the word plan here because in the transmission context, that usually means that those things that you have decided to do, but more like an assessment process for the longer run. An assessment that would include all the pieces, basically both the shorter run and the longer run. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And it would have three components, two of which you've already discussed here, which is the context at the beginning of this webinar, and then the near-term projects that are, in this case, driven a lot by what's in the queue that expand the ability of the system to deliver in the near term. A lot of engineering has already been done on them, costing and so forth. And then the third part is the longer run, let's say post 2030 or late in the decade into the 2030s, which really focuses more on new builds and that or increasing transmission capacity across the Cascades. There's kind of two parts to it. The new build part could include, for example, M2W Montana to Washington. But even beyond that, Bonneville has talked about a project concept called Garrison to Ash to get access to Montana wind and other resources. There are other possibilities. I know you're going to be talking about offshore wind here in a moment, but also some discussion about the a very old idea that might actually be a very good one, the Celilo to Meade second DC intertie. But I guess my point is, at what point do we have an ability to converse with Bonneville about those bigger picture issues, about the longer term scenarios and how to optimize the development of new renewables, clean energy, and new transmission in an effective way, and put it all into one process, into one place? Because right now we hear little bits here and there about these different ideas. We know Bonneville has already done a lot of long-term assessment work, but we don't have access to what that actually is. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is Bonneville willing then to take this next step to fold in that longer term assessment into the kind of approach you're talking about here? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. I would say slide 37 will kick off what you're asking about, and I'll let Michelle cover that when we get there. But, I think that that's part of what this is about and kind of what we're building towards as we're talking about the evolving grid. It is that long-term future, and working through, well, I don't want to steal her thunder, so I'm going to make you wait on the edge of your seat for when Michelle gets there.
I was going to say the same thing, Ricky. I'll hit that at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Ricky. So Fred, we will make sure that we try and address your thoughts directly when we get to that point in the presentation. A couple more folks here and then we can move on to offshore wind. Michael, you had a clarifying comment in the chat. I want to make sure we address that around a certain statement that somebody made, but I'm not sure who it was in reference to. So Michael Watkins with Seattle City Light. Okay,
yeah, Michael Watkins, Seattle City Light. The comment was about the statement of that the needs for 2030 for meeting the needs of the customers and BPA's footprint for meeting the Climate Commitment Act and the carbon regulations was handled. And I want to know what that was based on. It seems unlikely, and from Seattle's perspective, 2030 is coming at us like a freight train, and it's not quote unquote handled yet, in our opinion.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and yeah, thanks for the ability to clarify here. So that's from a Bonneville bulk transmission perspective, and the study that I was referring to is we conducted, I think it's been 2 years ago now, 80% decarbonization look, where we looked at 80% load on the system, and we're not counting on the 4.5 gigawatts of West Side thermals that I was mentioning, and looked at the reliability study results associated with that, running NERC compliance studies, and we did share those results with our transmission planning counterparts in the Puget Sound and Portland area.
Thank you.
But again, I was looking at the transmission system.
Michael, did that clarify for you?
It does. I'll find a copy of that and I'll provide some comments on that. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Nicole, you are next. You want to go ahead and ask your question, please.
Sure, thank you. Hi, Nicole Hughes, Executive Director of Renewable Northwest. I feel like maybe for a subsequent conversation, and I just want to say I'd like to see BPA hold these like on a quarterly basis going forward. That would be my recommendation. But I think we need to address this 2030 ability to meet 2030 goals in depth, because it feels to me like the mismatch is between BPA's view of its own system decarbonization and the utilities who are compliant to state law within the BPA footprint or reliant on BPA, because we've done some analysis of our members who are in the queue to provide those megawatts to these IOUs, and they're telling us that the upgrades that will be needed to meet the current IRP and RFPs that are on the street will not be done by 2030. And if those will not be done by 2030, then there will be no way for the IOUs to meet their 2030 requirements. And so I feel like maybe from BPA's perspective, your internal decarbonization metrics is completely different than what the state laws are telling the BPA customers to do. And so we need to really, like, maybe go one step further into what BPA's responsibilities are to help its customers meet state law. And I don't think that conversation has been had yet. And from my perspective, if you don't start tomorrow with construction of these upgrades that you've identified here, we will not meet the 2030 standards, and it will be, we will not be able to meet the standards beyond 2030 then if we're just going to continue to kick the can down the road. So I would like there to be some further analysis before our next conversation around this issue, if you could. Thank you.
Yeah, we have proposed taking a similar study through Northern Grid or perhaps the Transmission Planning Committee at the Western Power Pool. It's been ongoing discussions for some time, like I mentioned, but perhaps that may be, I guess, one avenue to look at that further, Nicole.
I mean, honestly, sorry, we don't need more studies of this. You have the information, you have the IRPs, you have the RFPs, you have the queue that's going to be used to meet those needs. We just need to move forward on these upgrades. We do not need any more studies that show how we're not going to meet these standards.
Well, I think what the important piece about the studies is that it sounds like we don't agree on what reinforcements are needed to get us there. And like I started this section with, we believe that the exception being the Portland area upgrades, which we have energization dates planned in 2027 to get those in service. Those being the exception, we don't believe these projects are needed to help our customers meet their decarbonization, 2030 decarbonization goals. We're looking at these as getting us beyond 2030.
So it sounds like there's Nicole, to your point, there's some follow-up, and again, the information we're hearing today is we're soaking in, and I'm sure there will be very robust internal discussions after today, particularly as we start going into our strategic redevelopment that Richard mentioned earlier. But Nicole, also please feel free to follow up via email. You can send it in through your AE or through the Tech Forum email. We welcome those written comments just to help ensure that we're actually hearing exactly what you are saying and asking for. Moving on, just a couple more so we can get to the next set of slides. Sorry. Emily is asking if we can share that 80% study, Ricky, that you've mentioned a couple times.
Yeah, I saw that. I know that we summarized into a presentation. I don't know that that will meet folks' needs. I don't know that we actually wrote a kind of formal report on that. So I'll take that follow-up, Sean, and I'll see what we can share, what we have.
Thank you. And if we do, we'll probably issue like either a tech forum and post to where we have the materials on our transmission business model page, if we are able to do a share, Emily. And then Jason, you had made a quick comment in here around the key dynamics at play. And did you want to make any further comment on that, or are you good?
No, I'm good. I just thought that maybe was helpful, but it sounds like we've beat that bush pretty good.
Thank you, Jason.
Maybe I'll jump ahead. I was jumping ahead. Maybe that'll help us move ahead, actually. But on slide 30, it's an Oregon state goal. I can like chime in when you get to that part, just to clarify for folks if they're curious. So feel free to jump back to me if you want.
Okay, thank you, Jason.
Oh, thanks, Jason.
And then finally, Spencer, I know that there's been some back and forth with Jeff in the chat. Are you good for now, or to move forward, or did you have another specific question or clarification you'd like to?
No, thanks to Jeff and Kelly for adding some detail there.
Okay. All right, Ricky, we can go ahead and proceed.
All right, offshore wind. And I think the plan is to take a short break after these 3 slides here. So I guess, kind of encapsulated this into sharing some of the information just because of the tremendous interest and numerous studies that are going on around offshore wind. But I think the bigger kind of awareness piece that we wanted to raise is that there's a lot of new resources, new ideas that are being floated in terms of bringing resources online, you know, and I think what we wanted to share is that we're kind of tracking all of them, you know, and we understand that there's different interests and different folks looking at different things, but, you know, whether it's small modular nuclear reactors or hydrogen conversion of the existing gas fleet or offshore wind, like we're aware of kind of what's going on in our territory and kind of tracking that. But certainly one that has been getting a lot of interest and is a bit different. Someone alluded to this earlier because of the transmission impacts that would be associated with bringing on large-scale offshore wind or large-scale resources is offshore wind. And so we have a few slides here that kind of catches folks up on where we're at with some of the work that we've been doing to study offshore wind. So on this slide, you know, first kind of the landscape here, you know, basically offshore wind in the Pacific coast, it has to be a floating technology. So we have the continental shelf is there's a very steep drop off off the coast of Oregon where the highest potential offshore wind capacity exists. And because the ocean is so deep there, it will require a tethered technology for floating offshore wind turbines in order to get offshore wind development there off the southern Oregon coast. We can go to the next slide, Sean. So like I mentioned, there's been a lot of studies, whether it's PNNL or I believe it's Humboldt State University is going through a study right now. There was an offshore wind study that was released by Northern Grid, and then Bonneville has done some internal studies to look at this as well. Basically, what we found is that we can interconnect roughly 1 gigawatt of offshore wind as long as it's not all interconnecting into the same place. The 2 kind of stiffest buses that we have readily available today, 230 kV buses at Wenson and Fairview, together can accommodate about 1 gigawatt of wind with modest upgrades. Think in the range of like $60 to $100 million. Brookings has kind of the most offshore wind potential. However, and I'm kind of commingling information that's on different slides here, so forgive me, I may kind of skip over the last one. The existing terrestrial coast system was really built out for kind of small, you know, moderate climate communities that exist along the Oregon coast. There are some areas that were built out a little bit more robust. Typically, there was like large sawmills and stuff, lumber mills in those areas. And so there are some areas that have kind of robust transmission capacity, and that's how we get to that about gigawatt of existing terrestrial transmission capacity off the coast area. That Brookings area is not really one of those. It would take significant reinforcement, and the reason why that matters is that area down there out of Gold Beach has been called the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. There's just tremendous offshore wind potential that exists there. And one of the real benefits to offshore wind, and we didn't get too much into this in other slides, but as we reduce the use of the carbon emitting resources, one of their greatest attributes is that they were dispatchable, right? Or they were baseload units that were kind of there to provide that spinning inertia on the system. And then also, like for example, Klamath Falls Cogen was there in case there was a need, right? You could fire them up and meet peak demand. Well, the solar panels, photovoltaic, dependent on the sun being out. The wind is dependent on the wind blowing. But what we do see from numerous studies and reports is that offshore wind has a much higher capacity factor than terrestrial wind. And so that's kind of one of the real benefits that it could potentially bring. Jason, maybe you want to comment on bullet 4 there?
Sure. I'll just try to explain it clearly and simply, do my best. So that target, this 3 gigawatts, the hop on the next slide too, because that's kind of informing some of these studies. Got to pick a number. So where's the number come from?
Jason, we're having a hard time hearing you.
Yeah, you're starting to fade out a little there.
Let me lean into my microphone a little bit more. Is that better?
That's better.
That is better.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. The 3 gigawatt number, essentially, I'll back up. It came out of House Bill 3375. That was passed in 2021. The language is essentially a state policy goal to plan for the development of up to 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind energy projects within federal waters off the Oregon coast by 2030. So that last part, kind of about how it's helping us plan with BOEM, which wasn't talked about much, but it was on the last slide, the jurisdictional element there. And this is all about site control. So, you know, working with, but that 3 gigawatt number from House Bill 3375 is helping state agencies basically plan all around offshore wind. It could be environmental impacts potentially, you know, from other state agencies looking at, you know, how do you wrap your hands around what this could be? Well, let's look at up to 3 gigawatts for now. So it's kind of like where we're at right now in the process. It's not a procurement mechanism of any sort. So it's not a commitment to offshore wind. It's kind of using, you know, it's helping us plan with BOEM. It's helping us do northern grid studies and other things. It's helping us with a number of what this could look like, essentially. Hopefully that's enough.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And I probably should have said before I hand it over to you, Jason's senior policy analyst to the Oregon Department of Energy. So that's why we let him comment on his comment there. But he's not from Bonneville.
Yeah, thanks, Ricky. It's just not necessarily our independent department goal of 3 gigawatts. It's a little bigger and a little broader and a little different animal. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
Ricky, this is Randy Hardy again. Can I add something here?
Hey, Randy, sure.
You missed one important policy objective in these 3 slides. You got the one that says that you got 2 important policy objectives here. Number 1 is the one you've got, which is we can integrate a gigawatt without building new transmission lines. Number 2 is what the Northern Grid study showed. And you needed another slide from the one that Northern Grid presented at the PNUC meeting last month that has the 500 kV loop in here to show, okay, here's what the solution is if you go above a gigawatt, i.e. to get to 3 gigawatts, you need to build a whole 500 kV loop, which, as I understand it, is probably 150 or 160 miles of new 500 kV line with 2 new 500 kV substations, all crisscrossing the Cascade Range or running along the coast of Oregon. That's extremely important. I mean, regardless of the cost, whether politically you can even attempt that is a tall order. And that's the other major policy point that you could illustrate with that one other slide from Northern Grid that shows the 500 kV loop and the amount of miles that are involved and what it's crossing. I think for future presentations, you should plan on doing that, because the second point about what additional 500 kV construction is required, all new right-of-way to get to 3 gigawatts is really important, because that raises all kinds of issues.
Yeah, we did kind of allude to that, Randy, there in bullet 2 on slide 30, and then also we referenced other studies there on slide 31. But yeah, you're probably right. I mean, the graphic that showed that 500 kV loop would probably be good.
Yeah.
So maybe for those that are less familiar, the Northern Grid
crossing the Oregon Cascade Range with most of that 160 miles. That is an enormous challenge. That the legislature needs to understand, before, and good luck to them if they decide to do that. But boy, that's a really heavy lift. So
yeah, for those that are maybe not as familiar, I would recommend getting the study from Northern Grid. I believe it's publicly available. And that was a study that Bonneville was involved in, and kind of one of the benefits of that study is that, of course, Northern Grid, being the regional planning entity, took a kind of one utility approach to what that build out would look like, but it was very similar in terms of getting to the 3 gigawatts at the plans of service that were required. So like Randy was mentioning, it found the need for 2 500 kV lines back to the Eugene area, essentially.
Ricky, just quick clarification. These, I know it's far off, but the Northern Grid model was showing it's stretching, the new facility is stretching over the coastal range or the Cascade Range?
No, the coastal range.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you, Randy, for that clarification. And then we had Jason. Did you have your hand raised again?
Well, I appreciate Randy highlighting,
Jason, can you lean into your microphone again?
Yeah, I am. Is it better? Okay, well,
likely.
My only point is that I think the transmission challenges are applicable to other resources as well. I mean, the floating offshore wind one could be a decent one just to use as an example to highlight challenges. Building construction challenges, siting, permitting challenges, all the challenges with transmission, but I don't know if those are necessarily unique to floating offshore wind. I mean, it's a big resource, but any other big resource would have challenges.
Okay, and yeah, Jason, your microphone is it is a little bit tough. We can barely make you out. But was there a year associated with the 3 gigawatt goal?
Well, 2030, if that was, people were waiting. I mentioned that, but it's not in writing on any of these slides, so you can remember that. It's 2030, but.
Thanks. And yeah, we had a question in the chat around that, so thank you. Fred, did you want to ask your question or
It was really just more to make a quick point. I don't want to distract the discussion, but as I said in the chat, I think it's time to look at the potential of AC to DC conversions. I know Jeff Cook has talked about this in the past, but both for getting across the Coast Range and for coming west across the Cascades, because precisely what Randy mentioned about the difficulty of new builds, particularly in those areas.
Thank you, Fred. We did have a request, if anybody from Northern Grid is on, to please post the link if it is available, if it is publicly available. That would be a nice resource. But Ricky, we're good to move forward.
Okay. I think I covered the contents of the next slide. So I think we can go to a break. I'll leave it to someone else. I'm not sure who to determine how long that's going to be.
Yeah, let's just do a quick 5-minute break. Bio break, refresh your afternoon coffees, spritzers, whatever. And we'll be back at 3:05. Okay?
And at that point, I'll say maybe I'll introduce Kevlin now. So Kevlin Baker will go over some of the transmission policy changes that we're have underway right now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ricky. All right, Kevlin, are you all set?
I am.
All right, excellent. So before we move on to Kevlin, I do want to again thank everybody for all the comments in the chat and on the webinar. Please, if you have additional comments or feel like you want it to really kind of be explicit in how you're framing a question or a comment, please do send it into Tech Forum. Again, techforum@bpa.gov, and we will ensure that those comments get out to the team for consideration. And that said, Kevlin, I think we are ready to move forward.
All right, thanks. So hello, my name's Kevlin Baker, like Ricky and Sean introduced me. I work in BPA's customer service engineering group within transmission planning. Our group supports the administration of the 3 distinct queues: generation, transmission, and line and load that Ricky mentioned earlier. So I'm just going to briefly talk through some of the improvements BPA is currently working on or has already implemented in some cases related to these processes. Next slide. So for the generation queue reform, FERC published a notice of proposed rulemaking last year related to the large generation interconnection procedures, moving from the current pro forma serial process to a first ready, first served cluster study model. BPA is engaging customers through a series of workshops in February through May to discuss those potential reforms to the LGIP, to develop and implement a more regional solution to improve BPA's interconnection process. That will move in, and BPA may conduct a TC25 terms and conditions tariff proceeding to then set or modify the terms and conditions of our open access transmission tariff specifically for those generator reforms. Some of the reforms that we're working on are that first ready, first served cluster study, readiness requirements, which is actually the reform that I am the lead for, study financials, network costs, technical study requirements, study flexibility, and then the transition process into the new queue. The objective of those proposed reforms are to increase the speed of interconnection queue processing, as well as addressing our current queue backlogs and delays. So some of you may have been on the workshop that we just wrapped up this morning, where Bonneville presented our staff leanings. Next slide. So the transmission service request queue. The recent T-sub cluster study cycles have faced issues that are impeding our ability to have a sustainable and repeatable quality product around the increased volume, complexity, and lack of specificity of requests. So one of the things that we've implemented is data exhibit changes to collect those data exhibits at the time of the TSR and NT forecast submission. So in other words, the data exhibits are now a part of the completed application into our cluster study. Enhancements were also made to the point-to-point and NT data exhibit templates to increase user friendliness, as well as for BPA to acquire that appropriate granularity of information to perform actionable studies. BPA will notify customers of any identified deficiencies in the data exhibits and provide customers that opportunity of 5 business days to rectify and cure any deficiencies. Otherwise, the TSR will be declined. So those business practice changes pertinent to the data exhibit reform were effective in March 24th of this year. Next slide. So this is just related to the line load queue. So there was a TC24 settlement obligation that before our next proceeding, or TC26 proceeding rather, BPA will hold a stakeholder workshop to discuss BPA's line and load interconnection procedures and potential reforms that we may be interested in making to the load interconnection queue. We have done internal work outside of the tariff process to try to streamline the interconnection facility studies, working closely and consulting with our engineering organization to provide that right-size scoping for projects. And hopefully, we're anticipating that will result in a reduction of the overall facility study duration. All right, I think those are my slides. And I will turn it over to Mark Tucker.
So I want to pause there real quick, Kevlin, and see, were there any questions for Kevlin on those in-flight policies? Or actually, some transmission one is actually done and in place, so. Not. All right, Mark, are you all ready?
Great. Thanks, Kevlin. Thanks, Sean. My name is Mark Tucker. I work in the Transmission Marketing and Sales organization. I supervise the Transmission Product Management and Market Analysis team. And so I wanted to focus for just a minute on our NT product and some of the changes that we're working on over the coming year or so. The first one, we're planning to implement some additional modules in our OASIS software. We held some public workshops last year to go through the available modules and make some decisions. We're currently in the detailed planning stages, and implementation of those will move us closer to industry standard and allow us to automate some processes. We're also currently preparing some new educational materials related to load growth for NT customers, how the planning processes work, and answer some questions that we hear fairly frequently from customers these days. We're planning to present that material at a customer meeting in June. That hasn't been scheduled yet, so keep your eyes out for an announcement via Tech Forum. We'll post that information on bpa.gov once it's scheduled. And we're also putting a focus on our forecasting and planning processes that relate to NT customers. With an increasingly congested grid, we just need more certainty in our forecasts in order to plan effectively. And the annual NT load and resource forecasting process is a key to this. Blake mentioned 10-year forecasts and how those are included in planning studies. This NT load and resource forecasting process is the mechanism that we use to collect those 10-year forecasts from NT customers, both load forecasts and resource forecasts, so that we can be planning to serve future load service needs. So we really urge customers to be participating in that forecasting process. We also encourage you to submit out-of-cycle updates at any time. You can do that at any point of the year, and we really encourage you to let us know early and often about any potential changes to your loads or resources, even if they're fairly uncertain. You may know the BPA load forecasting group only includes new loads if there's a 70% probability. But we don't use that threshold in transmission. We would like to hear from you about potential changes to your forecasts as early as possible. And then also on the policy front, in the coming year, we plan to evaluate some current NT processes that relate to the use of unknown market purchases in resource forecasts and clarifying our policy on what is sufficient to encumber capacity on the transmission system. We'll plan to conduct customer engagement and seek feedback as part of that policy review. And we also plan to look at our current practice of requiring 60 days prior notice to make a long-term network resource designation, which is a requirement for NT customers to secure firm transmission. Again, the purpose there is to ensure that we have adequate time to study new resources and can encumber the requested capacity. And I will just pause here for a second to see if there are any questions or hands raised.
We do have a hand raised from Mr. Weathers.
Okay.
Blake.
Hey, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead, Blake.
Yeah, Blake Weathers with Umatilla Electric. Couple questions or maybe comments, don't know which. Yeah, thank you for bringing up, the customers communicating on changes to 10-year load forecasts early and often. I just want to double down and reiterate, we see that as our mechanism for our inputs into Bonneville's base case study and reinforcing its transmission system to meet NT customers' load growth. So just can't say that enough. Second point is, or I guess this question is that last bullet, evaluation of current DNR timing requirements. If I kind of read into what you said, is Bonneville going to be proposing that they change that timing to greater than 60 days? And if the answer is yes to that, do you have any inkling as to what that might look like in terms of the number of days? And then last thing, and sorry to shotgun approach you here, but could you go in just a little bit more detail, maybe like an example or two of what you're thinking for the education on load growth planned in June of 2023? What might be a topic or two? And to build on that, is there any opportunities for customers maybe to inform what might be included there insofar as content, questions, et cetera? So thank you.
Yeah, great comments and questions. Thanks for the reinforcement on the importance of the 10-year forecasting process. Appreciate that. We really encourage customers to participate there. The second question was the 60-day DNR timing. We haven't really started developing alternatives or any kind of recommendations. So I can't comment on where that might go or make a speculation there. But we will be engaging with customers as we go through that process. And then the last question on load growth. Yeah, so we get a fair number of questions. Umatilla being one of the ones that have really kind of driven some of our sharpening of our thinking and processes here with so much load growth. A lot of these questions about how do the load forecasts really play into our planning studies? What's the responsibility of BPA versus responsibility of customers when new builds are identified? What's the role of TCEP versus base case studies? Some of those topics, I think we're breaking some new ground and answering some questions we haven't answered very clearly in the past.
That's great news.
We do intend to post the materials in advance of the workshop as usual, and certainly invite comment. I don't believe we're planning to ask for input officially before the workshop, but we'll certainly take comments and feedback during and after.
Okay. Well, selfishly speaking, it sounds like you've got at least some of the key issues that I'm going to be keenly interested in. So thank you.
I hope so. Please let us know if we don't.
Okay, I will.
Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Mark. Mark, we have another question from Alex. Alex, you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute?
Thanks. This is Alex, PNGC Power, and I just wanted to follow up to Blake's comment there. We also kind of see this forecasting process and new data exhibit as our way of really looking to encumber transmission, and hope that the kind of list Blake had laid out is a big part of those topics that we discuss in this future discussion. But I also just want to say this kind of new current policy with these data exhibits, it's a little tough to meet at times when we're looking at actually being able to procure these resources to kind of meet these and meet more of a larger load growth. When you have kind of a 60 calendar day period, it doesn't give much time to actually be able to lock down a PPA. And it's very hard to actually have a PPA and a specified resource in place without knowing if you're able to get that transmission. And getting through a study to know what some of those constraints are helps in being able to identify creatively, a resource mix that could meet that if it's not just a resource. When you think about a lot of renewables, they aren't able to really meet a 24/7 flat profile. And so you have to combine that. And so you'll need transmission from usually multiple areas to make sure you're sort of meeting that need. And again, 60 days can be very, very challenging to be able to actually lock down kind of those resource types. And then I also must say, kind of current market and the way the West, the Northwest is really operating today is kind of a bilateral nature. And so how does that really work with being able to utilize, which you may see is the market hub, where you may not actually have that upstream resource. You'll have, most likely a firm energy output, but not a designated resource that you can point to. And so I think those are big issues we need to keep discussing, kind of as we move forward, because it really makes it challenging to meet these loads using this NT product for load servers.
Thanks, Alex. Those are good comments.
Thank you, Alex, for those. Okay. Any other comments from Mark at this time? Lots more to come, right, Mark?
Lots more to come. And so I think at this point, I'm turning it over to Michelle Maneri.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. So we've heard from a number of folks today kind of what we're doing now. And I think it was very important to ground folks in that we know that's not everything, but we wanted to let folks know that we are doing some stuff and we are advancing in some areas, whether you think it's enough or too much or just right. We wanted to make sure folks understand what we were doing. But here we are. Where are we heading? We know that that more is needed. We can't, and I think FERC has said this too, looking at current processes, looking at the status quo will not work. And so we need to look into the future. And so part of that future is unfolding before us. You heard Kevin talk about how we're looking at our generation interconnection queue reform and what we're doing there, and really trying to lean forward and think through how do we get kind of in a faster manner with the rest of the country, because we're not alone, how do we get folks connected so they can get to the loads, and how do we get loads connected, kind of at the table so that they can make an informed decision on which generation is best for their profile. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to talk about some of the things that are happening, but I do want to mention, I'm going to say this is going to take a village. And why I say this is because a lot of times folks think, oh, there's a silver bullet. Only if so-and-so would do something, it'll all be better. We know that's not right. This is physics. In the end, transmission is physics. And so, and you see there's load and there's generation and then there's wires in between. And so when we talk about where we're heading, it's going to be conversations. It's going to be talking about some of those hard issues that we've kicked the can on, we've been able not to talk about, like cost allocation and risk sharing and how are we going to get there together. Ricky even talked a little about just us putting some of our reinforcements in the Hillsborough area. It takes PGE doing their piece as well in order for us to get a whole system. So you're going to hear me saying that a number of times, and why we're starting off with these conversations, why we're going to start off with our strategic plan grounding us in goals and objectives. So, but at the same time, the world is also evolving. So on the next slide, you're talking about markets. A lot of folks are here. The region stepped into the EIM market, which is just the day. It optimizes, it optimizes generation and load and transmission, and so it optimizes what you have. But we're also involved in the next phase, which is the day-ahead markets, whether it be with CAISO or with SPP Markets Plus. We are definitely involved looking at any tool that we can use with the markets to optimize what we have, because I think that's your low-hanging fruit. Can you get more out of what you have? Now, with that, it's a very important underpinning. but it's not the panacea. It's not the end all to be all. And so, but I wanted to make sure that that is one of the tools we are looking at to help kind of get the most we can reliably, resiliently, safely in today's world, really looking and leaning hard into to those markets and those tools that will help us optimize the transmission. So besides markets, next slide, we're also going to launch our agency strategy. I know a number of folks have been hearing about this. We've had John Harrison's been talking about this, but we're going to update our strategy. Bonneville's strategy refresh is coming out in the next couple of months. With that, and on the heels of that, transmission will be actually updating our business model to align with the agency's update. So that's one of the ways we make sure that we are staying connected, and part of that conversation or that update will be conversations with customers and stakeholders. I'm really saying, looking at our business model, we've done it, I think it was about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, are there certain areas we need to look at it a little differently, or is it just a refresh? And so we will be launching that. We really wanted to make sure we were tied to the agency strategy refresh, and so that's why you haven't seen us come out yet, but that will be on the heels of the strategy refresh. So it is a deliberate strategy. We hear folks, we hear that you need to go faster, but you need to do wiser and don't put costs, unnecessarily costs. And so it's really threading the needle, but I think it's important to get the understanding, the region to understand everybody and have the voices heard how Bonneville is going to go forward in the transmission space. Next slide, John. So on the horizon, what does that mean? And so you've already heard from Kevlin, the generation interconnection queue reform. So remember, the conversations and the workshops we're having right now is just the precursor. We're actually going to have a transmission case at TC25, and that will result in tariff policy changes, or tariff changes, policy, business practices. And so we are committed to that. Remember, we were so committed that we launched that early. We didn't wait till the next rate cycle. We put it in between because we heard and we agree that it is important to get some of those changes as fast as possible. Second item there is the business model I was talking about before. And so we're working on the project plan, the release plan, not the release plan, but the engagement plan and the release, I guess, on the materials and starting those conversations. You will be seeing that soon. And so when we talk about the evolving grid, a big part of that will be these collaborative stakeholder conversations to make sure we are all tied and grounded in a common understanding and a common vision. Last slide. So what does that mean? So folks that know me, I think it's exciting times. I know I hear frustration. I hear kind of how are we going to do this fast? Unfortunately, electrons are physics-based and they're not policy-based. And so we are tied to those a bit. Planning takes, anybody that's been through any environmental planning. I think I saw in the chat as well about even trying to get over the Cascades range with, 500 kV. Those are the realities. Those are also the challenges that this industry and has come together and solved. And so, so what does that mean? So going forward, there's no silver bullet, and I wish there was, but there isn't. It's going to take us all coming together, loads, generation, resources, stakeholders, everybody coming together to figure out that long-term plan. Ricky and folks talked about kind of that, our normal processes, and usually that 10-year look. We're going to be looking further. So this is really about the conversation, how do we get the region and the needs that Bonneville will supply to our customers, how do we get that going, because it will take a long time, to get some of the stuff done, just because of the reality of transmission. How do we get that going? Where are we going, heading towards? And tackling those tough questions that we as a region have tackled in the past, but haven't had to tackle recently. And so I would actually say for all of you here, please, please, please engage with us. We are going to, like I said, we'll have a plan, and we will look to engage with you, but engage and listen to others. One of the things that you heard kind of Ricky trying to do, as well as Kevin and others, is we're trying to find kind of that perfect, that sweet spot. What will enable all the customer needs, enable the stakeholder needs, but not overburden one group or the other, that it's appropriate, balanced. I would say a balanced approach, which is why I keep saying it's going to take a village, because this is not something that one entity can solve on their own. It's going to take all of us. Now, BPA is there and ready to work with folks and hear different perspectives and hear different ways in order to achieve our regional goals, and we look forward to those conversations. And with that, I'm going to pause because I know some folks wanted to probably jump in and ask some questions.
Michelle, Sydney was asking about if we can talk any more about the timing of the two strategic initiatives you mentioned.
Yep, I see it. So Sydney, Bonneville is getting ready, I'm guessing in June, to release its agency strategic plan. So that is, the power, it's all of Bonneville. And of course, there'll be pieces on infrastructure and commercial and stuff like that, but that level. Then transmission has one that goes really, it looks at the transmission aspect and the transmission business line. So it takes the agency and breaks it down even more. And so we're looking at in the transmission world more of the little more specifics of how transmission is going to enable some of the larger agency goals. I'm reading Steve and Melanie.
Well, I actually enjoyed the AA Milne quote.
So I would, this is good because I'm a huge, I grew up on Winnie the Pooh or AA Milne and Christopher Robin and all those characters, and that's why I keep, maybe it should take, when I say it takes a village, it will take a number of us coming together. And I think that's really important, to come to the table and listen to each other and try to figure out and be very specific on the goals, because I think we all are trying to achieve the same goal in the region. It's the how that where we get, it's the how and the cost allocation. I'm just gonna lay it on the table. How we balance that risk, whose it is. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we all have to come together, and because it will take all of us, Eeyore, Winnie the Pooh, Tigger, Roo, all of us together, and Christopher Robin. Yeah, and I would actually say also, it may take changes to others as well. We've seen this a lot in our generation interconnection workshops, where kind of that frustration, we're not, the RFPs are not necessarily aligned with our cycle, not necessarily aligned with, state cycles. And so I think that's part of the conversation we're going to have as well, as how we align some of these processes that make sense, if that's possible.
Are there
anything
any
else?
Other? Yeah, nothing right now, Michelle.
Okay. I think we've worn everybody out.
Well, here we go. Emily just posted something in the chat. Okay. So let's draw that strategic initiatives to what we were talking about earlier with Fred.
Yeah. So I think this is one area, and Jeff can jump into, Jeff Cook, because we're kind of in this together. And so I think this is one where it's recognized that doing our normal 10-year cadence. I mean, this is just industry-wide, everywhere. It was a 10-year cadence because things changed. And so you'd look at loads, you'd have resources come in, and so you'd only look 10 years out because so much was changing. I think the reality right now, and I think, Fred, this is what I was talking to, is you got to look further. But when you look further out, there are unknowns. And Ricky even said this, that nobody knows how we're going to get to 100% because we know technology will change. We know, loads will change, electrification ramp-ups will change. There's a lot of unknowns. And so I think that's where we have to look longer, but it's how we look longer and what we do with that is going to be the key to that. And I don't know, Fred, if you wanted to add anything else.
I can jump in whenever, but Fred, go first. Well, so certainly the long-term look, and from our strategic initiatives that we're looking at, several of them center around planning, both short-term, kind of our asset plan that we're doing now, as well as the long-term initiatives that we want to look at. And so through the TPL group, which is another long-term planning initiative group that we have within the planning organization, they really look at the 20 years. What's the long-term capacity expansion planning that we want to look at? What are those models? What are the lines, or how do we get to this 100% goal? What are the builds that continuously show up time after time in these models that we run? What's the best resource cost allocation our cost initiative that we should put forth? Is it cheaper from a resource on the east side or a west side or down south? Where are those resources coming from, and what is that cost per megawatt to bring it to the load? So those are all things that we are running those models. Certainly there's a lot of variables in those. We know with the time frame that you're looking at and how far out and the pace at which things are changing, they're certainly wrong, but it certainly gives you a place to start. So we are looking at those to try to meet those decarbonization goals and running those analysis. So I was happy to talk and sit down and go in more detail about it if we want to one-on-one and what we're doing and get some ideas from Fred and others. But that's part of the piece that supports that strategic initiative that BPA is putting out for that long-term asset management portion, as well as from a customer responsive piece of things.
Yeah, and scenario, it's scenario planning in the past, especially when in that era where we didn't have a lot of growth, you didn't have to have that as much because you had a generator coming on, going to one or two loads. It was very consistent. But now with the onslaught of kind of the generation changing, the load changing, you got to be comfortable with scenarios. And I think just be in a world that how you use those, like Jeff said, you have to use those in some of your planning in the future. And we'll talk about those because I think it's going to be either Jeff just volunteered to sit down with everybody, but I will say we will make sure we will include some of that stuff when we have the conversations with our customers and stakeholders. So you have an idea of what we're looking at and what we're thinking in that longer term horizon, post 10 years.
But certainly to Emily and Fred and others, certainly sit down and discuss some of those things. Oh, I just see Ravi's chat about the outcomes and challenges that we see. So obviously like to group together and try to, bundle this together and talk with you. But if you do wish to dive in this deeper, certainly get with Michelle and her team, AE team, and we can work to set some time up in the future.
Yeah. Did we wear everybody down?
Well, yeah, maybe. Emily, Fred, did either of you want to come on to the line and ask any further, or are you guys good?
This is Fred. Nothing further really, but just to follow up, we're happy to follow up with you, kind of one-on-one, but we also would like to see more of this kind of stakeholder, everybody at the table kind of discussion about these longer term development issues. Broadly speaking, I would call it expansion. It's of great interest to lots of different people from lots of different perspectives. And we know that Bonneville has done a lot of analytical work on this, and it would be good to talk about, what you're seeing and how you're doing that, and maybe figure out how to fold it into a more of a real public process here. Thanks.
Yeah, good feedback, Fred. Thank you.
And Fred, I certainly would want to pull in Northern Grid into this discussion as well, because certainly, as you know, they're working on the 20-year cycle or the plan as well, which is due, I don't know, winter, fall, or spring of next year sometime. I don't have the exact date here on hand, but that certainly will give us also a look from what they're doing. The National Transmission, like I said, study plan that's underway. I know that's has a lot of good, valuable information in it. I think also, I don't know if it's Emily or somebody else mentioned, PNNL has been working a lot on this, us with them as well in the labs. So there's a lot of work on it, and it's certainly bigger than just BPA. It's a regional issue, as Michelle has talked about, and to address this, because obviously BPA cannot solve this problem alone.
Yeah, this is Fred. Couldn't agree more. And yet it's still ultimately, you know, Bonneville, as you mentioned at the very beginning, has 3/4 of the transmission line miles in the region and, you know, the big core system. So it really does get back to what your planning shop is doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We will definitely be part of that conversation at the heart of it. And so we hear you, Fred.
So on the topic of studies, I did want to make sure that everyone saw Ricky's earlier comment that the Northern Grid offshore wind study is going to be available for public comment somewhere near the end of June. So just for folks interested in that topic, be looking for that. But right now, there are no raised hands. There are no further questions. I guess just looping back, did we respond to everybody in the chat? Try to do a good job, but oh, Spencer.
Hey, thanks.
There you go.
Michelle and Jeff, thanks a lot for presenting this again. And I want to echo Fred and Nicole's comments that I think this is a great kickoff for holding more of these going forward here. And I know you're planning on that, so thumbs up on that. Two questions that I wondered if you might be able to preview some of your strategic thinking for this group. One is in relation to what Bonneville's sort of overall role is in the Northwest in building new transmission capacity. When the Bonneville system was built in the first half of the agency's existence, there were a lot fewer models of private transmission development. We have a number of merchant proposals in the West as a whole, and kind of new models of joint ventures. So relying on a federal transmission builder as sort of the contractor of first resorts, not necessarily the first option facing us, and that obviously puts pressure on customer rates too. So I wondered if you could maybe comment on how you're thinking about Bonneville fitting into the current landscape of transmission developers. And then the second question's a little bit similar, and maybe Michelle, drawing on your recent experience helping to implement some of what Congress passed recently for federal transmission authorities. Is there anything that you're drawing as an initial lesson of what other transmission providers are doing to get their arms around the spike in transmission service requests nationally? Those are my two questions. Thanks.
So Spencer, I'll take the easy one first, which is the second question, because as you said, for those that don't know, I spent the last year and a half at DOE in their helping stand up their transmission division under the Grid Deployment Office, and saw the new legislature come through and everything like that. And I think Spencer said that Federal's trying to get their arm around just nationally. You see it with FERC, you see it with NARUC, which is the state's, you know, kind of consortium, and you see it with that. And I'd say for what we're seeing, and this is why we did a bunch of benchmarking with others, especially in the GI realm, generation and interconnection realm, to see what others have done that were maybe a little ahead of us, and learn and then talk about what's happening here in the region. But there is the feds do have several programs, and I think this is what we have to also understand as a group, that they did provide through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. They did provide funding for, especially in the the transmission, so for building some interregional transmission, as well as some resiliency, included wildfires and stuff like that. There is money out there that, which is why we all need to come together, because of certain, and certain folks can go after that. But that is something that that we need you to help. If you're going after that, we need to know, because if we have something on our end that you need us to do, then plan with us. Plan early, plan often. That's where your constituent AE account executive or your transmission account executive really comes in handy. And so please, please, please talk to us early, even if it's just a glimmer, if you're thinking about it, because we can help give you some guidance. Your AE and CAE can give you some guidance on what to think about. So I think, Spencer, as you're talking about kind of what the feds are doing and some of the what they're trying to do to get their arms around it. It's the National Transmission Planning Study that Jeff talked about, which is really looking at the different scenarios and what it takes interregionally to get to 100% carbon-free goals. And so I think that's one of the things the feds are doing, as well as providing some of that money up front to some areas. Now, in the transmission world, it's not going to be the panacea. It's, $2.5 billion for DOE being a backstop, which is basic to some of these large interregional projects. But $2.5 billion doesn't go far at all, as you know well. There's also, like I said, some of the grants to states, tribes, industry on a lot of the resiliency or kind of that forward-leaning R&D. And so it gets enough, but it pairs it with things that we're trying to do in the region. It pairs it with, and so it actually can help when we come together. It can help, because then it's not in somebody's rate base. I don't know if I answered that correctly, Spencer, or not, but
yeah, thanks, Michelle.
Or what you wanted me to get to.
No, just looking for some initial thoughts. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
Hey,
And
Michelle,
then,
if I could pop in, hey, this is Richard. And Spencer, I really appreciate that very general and broad question about the role of BPA and transmission in the region. And we certainly have a lot of accountability to the region in a lot of ways. First and foremost, I started with saying safe, reliable, and cost-effective transmission services to the region, and that has a base mission that we continue our strategies off of. Our environment is changing. We're seeing the generation mix change. We're seeing requests coming faster and at higher volumes than ever before. We're trying to keep up with the practices and the policies and the regulations and the compliance initiatives and the needs of the customers all at the same time. We're doing a lot, and we have a lot more we have to do. Our role is to be responsive to the needs of the Northwest. You're right, we have almost, by some measure, 75% of the grid, so it's a pretty large accountability. We want to help lead the conversations that ultimately respond to a carbon-free environment. That seems to be a huge challenge for the Northwest right now as we figure it out. I am proud to be part of an organization that provides a lot of carbon-free power already, but there's a lot more that can be done by connecting all the dots from around the system to all the loads and needs of the system. So we do have a lot of accountability to the region. I think today was intended to share a lot of what we are doing and what we're planning to doing, but it's not the end of the conversation. Michelle, to your point, there's a lot more to be discussed and talked about. There may be some specific forums that we need to carve out from the comments we saw today that targets certain parts of the discussion we had, but we welcome the collaboration. One thing we want to make sure we don't do is we don't shed our responsibility of being stewards of our ratepayers. We need to come up with the most cost-effective approaches. We don't want to have a lot of excessive spend. We want to spend it in the right places at the right time and make sure that the costs are allocated appropriately and that we are able to thread, and I appreciate, Michelle, what you said, thread that needle, right? And lastly, just kind of tie a bow on it, what you'll see in the upcoming strategy is a balance of cost effectiveness, a balance of supporting carbon-free initiatives, a balance of leading in the transmission space for the Pacific Northwest. And in some cases, that may actually go outside the region too. And we explore those opportunities as well and participate in other areas even beyond the region that helps the region. So it's a bit of an all of the above strategy as well as an all of the above accountability too. So it truly is threading a needle. But I really appreciate you posing that question, and it's a good way to kind of wrap up a lot of what we discussed today. And I'll stop taking the mic, Michelle, and turn it back to you.
No, we were just, thank you, Richard. I really appreciate that. So I think the theme here is more to come. Richard said it right, that this was just the start of the conversations. I really think, thank folks for giving us feedback on, does something like this work? Do we need more of the workshops? Do we need more of that? And I heard yes, I heard that. And then as we evolve and as we look towards that future and have those conversations, bringing folks back together is very valuable. So thank you for that, kind of confirming what we thought, but confirming it. Anything else, Sean? I can't see everybody.
Yes, we have a comment from Bill Henry. And Bill, I don't know if you want me to just read it or you would like to hop off mute and state your question. I can go ahead.
I think, can you guys hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Bill.
Thanks. So Bill Henry with Pacific Ocean Energy Trust. Again, the main thrust of the comment there was that we were hearing about scenarios and the variety of different scenarios to consider, and these federal studies, the National Transmission Planning Study, and also the offshore wind, West Coast offshore wind study. But then there's funding and IRA for that one. We're going to look at capacity expansion models and different scenarios. So that could be valuable information that could enter into processes along the way. So going forward, I think it'd be great to hear how that might inform and feed into the evolving conversation you're having here.
Yeah, so I will. So some of the chat we're saying it, and I'll let Jeff jump in. But we are very involved in those conversations. National Transmission Planning Study, which is PNNL and NREL. So two of those. Also, and I know that study is also calibrated with the offshore wind. So I will let Jeff handle, since he's kind of said it in the chat anyways, how they're planning on using that.
Yeah, so as I indicated in the chat, we've been tightly tied with them on all these studies, providing them data input, et cetera. And as I indicated, especially on the National Transmission Planning Study, they have the resources very tied to our planning group. So we have provide a lot of input for the Northwest side. So as we get those study results, the expectation is that we'll take kind of the output from those, certainly layer those into our models that we are running. And as I indicated, PCM, LTCEs, et cetera, that we'll be looking at and see how they factor in. Now, I don't know the results of those. I don't know if there'll be something new that pops out of it. Who knows? But it could certainly provide us some insight, something that we missed or overlooked, or something that, something that's changed on the bigger picture that will help direct us in a different direction, but it will certainly add some additional insight as we run our internal models and get better clarity on specific builds for BPA and ultimately the Northwest. So I'm not sure if I answered that question for you completely or not, Bill, but certainly, don't have what comes out of those yet, so certainly can't say how much it has benefited or not, but certainly I think we're looking for for everything that we've seen so far shows some good outputs or good potential outputs and something that we can use.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Jeff and Michelle. One last comment I see here. Actually, Robbie, you've got your hand raised. Did you want to say something?
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry, thank you, Sean. I just wanted to add that the current Northern Grid transmission plan for 22-23, it includes a lot of interregional projects that have been identified and being studied. including some of the Greenlink projects in Nevada. It has B2 Edge, Gateway West, and other projects. So there is a lot of movement happening in the Northern Grid forefront. So I would highly encourage folks to also follow the stakeholder process of Northern Grid, where they may be able to get additional information for the conversation that we had today. That's pretty much my comment. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Ravi. I did want to make sure, Nicole, you had a comment in here around the increased borrowing authority, and I didn't know if you would like to ask that. And
no, it was just a comment.
Okay.
You know, Michelle was outlining all the great programs that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I just, you know, wanted to remind folks that BPA was given additional borrowing authority to spend on infrastructure, so we should be considering that a benefit as well.
That's true. Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, I think I tend to look at that a little differently because we have to pay it back, but we needed it, and I would thank you so much for those of you that helped kind of advocate for that, because we would be having a much different conversation here today if we didn't have that. So you are correct, Nicole. That's a key piece that came out of that, the bipartisan infrastructure law.
All right. There are no other raised hands or comments that I can find. So I just want to double check with everybody. Are we good for now? Again, more to come. But hopefully this was a good start and laying the foundation, again, which was our main objective.
Hey, Sean, I just put it in the chat, and I thought we may be wrapping up, but maybe not. But let me go ahead and just inject my comment now. I want to say thank you to all the participants. At some point, I saw well over 200 folks on the WebEx, and a lot of great comments, a lot of great questions, a lot of great takeaways. This was very helpful. This really set out to be an information sharing session, and I hope we did achieve at least that objective, and I think we actually walked away with more than that by way of some additional feedback and comments for us to kind of follow up on, which we will. I also want to say a special thanks to all the BPA folks that not only presented, but were behind the scenes, that prepared the materials and set up the WebEx and got all the logistics together. Sean, thanks for your facilitating. Laura Green, thanks for leading the compilation of all the information. Just a great job all the way around. So I just wanted to get in there before everyone departed to say thanks and a lot of appreciation. Sean, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, Michelle, Jeff, any parting words from you guys? Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up, and I really thank you for these engagements and for the honest conversations and kind of I hear there's frustration sometimes and things aren't going fast enough, but unless we come together and talk, we're never going to get anywhere. And so I really do appreciate kind of folks coming together, and I do look forward to these conversations. I think it will be really great to think about, you know, like Fred said, you know, he had a paper and some thinkings and that stuff. We do glean and we do take, you know, and we incorporate some of these great ideas. Like I said, it takes a village. We need a village on this. And so I really do appreciate your engagement, and I look forward to chatting in the future.
I'll just say thank you all, and let everybody go out and enjoy the sun.
Yeah.
All right.
Have a good afternoon.
Okay, and so I just want to remind everybody that this is recorded. We're going to need a couple days just to process it, but we will post the recording to our transmission business model page. Again, you always have the Tech Forum email to submit any advanced comments or questions or clarifications as you need it. Otherwise, we thank everybody again for your engagement and participation today, and we will talk again soon. Thank you very much.